I never thought my life would take such a strange turn, especially not with her. My grandma, of all people, it started as something small, something I could easily shrug off. But looking back now, I should have noticed the signs, the lingering looks, the way she'd touch my shoulder a little too gently, the way her presence in the house began to feel different. The first time it happened, I was in the shower. The hot water cascaded over me, washing away the stress of the day. When I heard the door creak open, my heart stopped. I'd forgotten to lock it. "Jake," came her voice, soft and hesitant. "Grandma?" I called back, panic rising in my chest. "What are you doing?" "I noticed the soap was missing," she said, stepping into the bathroom. "I thought you might need it." I froze, the steam wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. "You could have just left it by the door," I said, trying to sound calm, even though my voice trembled. She didn't answer. Instead, I heard the soft thud of her bare feet against the tiles. She was getting closer. "I just wanted to help," she said, her tone warm and reassuring, like this was the most normal thing in the world. The shower curtain shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of her through the gap. She was holding a bar of soap, her eyes filled with concern, and something else I couldn't quite place. "Grandma," I said, my voice firm. "You don't have to." "Nonsense," she interrupted, her tone light but insistent. "You've been working so hard lately. Let me take care of you." Before I could protest, she pulled the curtain aside just enough to step in. The steam blurred everything, but not enough to hide the fact that she was wearing nothing but a silk robe. My throat went dry. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure she could hear it. "Grandma, this isn't," I stammered, stepping back, pressing myself against the cold tiles. She held up the soap, her expression calm and almost maternal. "Relax, Jake. It's just me," she said softly. "I've bathed you before, remember? When you were little." "This is different," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not a kid anymore." "I know," she said, her gaze steady. "That's why you need someone to take care of you, to help you unwind." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to push her away, to tell her this was wrong. But another part of me, the part one didn't want to admit existed, was frozen, unable to move. She reached for my shoulder, her touch light but firm, guiding me to turn around. "Let me help," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't resist. I couldn't. The feel of her hands on my back, the warmth of her touch, it was all too much. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. When she finally stepped back, her hands lingering for just a moment too long, she gave me a small smile. "There," she said. "All done." I turned to face her, my chest heaving, my thoughts a chaotic mess. "Grandma, this isn't normal," I said, my voice barely audible. She tilted her head, her expression soft but unreadable. "Who's to say what's normal?" she asked. "Sometimes we just have to take care of the people we love, no matter what." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left the bathroom, her robe fluttering behind her as she disappeared down the hall. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her words replaying over and over in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The next morning, everything felt different. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my bowl of cereal, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. The events of the previous night played on a loop in my head. Every time I thought I'd managed to push them aside, her words came rushing back. "Sometimes we just have to take care of the people we love." Grandma moved around the kitchen like nothing had happened, humming softly to herself as she made coffee. She looked calm, serene even, but I couldn't shake the tension in the air. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "You're quiet this morning," she said, glancing over her shoulder at me. "Didn't sleep well?" I hesitated, my spoon hovering over the bowl. "Yeah," I said finally. "Something like that." She smiled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something knowing. "Well, maybe you just need to relax. You've been working so hard lately." There it was again, that word, relax, as if that would magically make everything feel normal again. But nothing about this was normal. I spent the rest of the day avoiding her as much as I could. I went for a long walk, my thoughts racing with every step. I kept telling myself it was a one-time thing, a moment of awkwardness that we could both move past. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I waited until I was sure she was asleep before heading to the bathroom. I needed to clear my head, to wash away the confusion and guilt that clung to me like a second skin. But as soon as I stepped into the shower, I felt it, the weight of her presence. I turned, and there she was standing in the doorway. "Grandma," I said, my voice shaking. "What are you doing?" She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I heard the water running," she said softly. "I thought you might need some company." My heart pounded in my chest as she moved closer, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Grandma, this has to stop," I said, trying to keep my voice firm. "This isn't." "Chill," she said, pressing a finger to her lips. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen, trapped between wanting to push her away and wanting to understand why this was happening. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you don't have to be afraid. You can trust me." Her hand brushed against my arm, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. "Let me help you," she said again, her tone soothing. "You'll feel so much better." She stepped closer, her hand trailing down my arm to my wrist. And for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The sound of the water hitting the tiles faded into the background, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, she stepped back, her gaze soft but unreadable. "Think about what I said," she murmured before turning and leaving the bathroom. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the water cascading over me as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The following days were a blur of tension and avoidance. I tried to act like everything was normal, but it was impossible. Every time I saw her, my chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. She, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. Then, one evening, she cornered me in the living room. "Jake," she said, her tone calm but firm. "We need to talk." I looked up from the TV, my stomach twisting into knots. "About what?" "You know what," she said, sitting down beside me. "About us." Her words sent a jolt of panic through me, and I shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "There is no us," I said quickly. "You're my grandma. This is complicated," she interrupted, her gaze steady. "I know, but I also know what I feel, and I think you feel it too." I stared at her, my mind racing. "This isn't right," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not supposed to be like this." "Who decides what's right?" she asked softly. "Who decides how we're supposed to feel?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, and I felt like the ground was falling out from under me. Her words echoed in my mind long after she'd said them, each syllable twisting deeper into my thoughts like a blade. Who decides what's right? Who decides how we're supposed to feel? I couldn't answer her then, and I couldn't answer her now. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep felt like an impossible dream. My mind raced with everything she'd said, everything she'd done. I told myself I needed to put an end to this, to set boundaries before things spiraled even further out of control. But every time I thought about confronting her, my resolve crumbled. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She made breakfast, humming softly to herself, her movements calm and unhurried. I sat at the table, my appetite non-existent, and watched her with a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Not hungry?" she asked, glancing at me over her shoulder. I shook my head, my chest tight. "No." She set a plate of eggs and toast in front of me anyway, her hand brushing lightly against mine as she did. The touch sent a shiver through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, as if her skin had burned me. "Jake," she said softly, sitting down across from me. "We need to talk." "No, we don't," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "We really don't." She sighed, her gaze steady. "You can't keep avoiding this forever." "I'm not avoiding anything," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. I need space. Her expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost sad. I understand, she said quietly. But just remember, I'm here if you ever want to talk. The day passed in a blur of tension and silence. I avoided her as much as I could, spending most of my time outside or locked in my room. But no matter how far I tried to distance myself, I couldn't escape her presence. She was always there, lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. That night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront her, to make her understand that this couldn't continue. I waited until the house was quiet, the faint glow of her bedside lamp spilling into the hallway, and then I knocked on her door. "Come in," she said softly. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but unreadable. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. But then I took a deep breath and forced the words out. "This has to stop," I said, my voice trembling. "Whatever this is, it can't keep happening." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "Why not?" she asked. "What are you so afraid of?" "Everything," I said, my chest tightening. "What people would think. What this is doing to us. To me." Her gaze softened, and she stood, closing the distance between us in a few slow steps. "Jake," she said, her voice gentle. "You don't have to be afraid. This doesn't have to be something bad." "It already is," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And you know it." She reached out, her hand brushing lightly against my arm. "Do I?" she asked. "Because all I see is someone who's scared of what he feels. Someone who's too worried about what other people might think to admit the truth." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I took a step back, shaking my head. "This isn't about feelings," I said. "It's about what's right. And this, whatever this is, it's not." "Who decides what's right?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Society? Strangers who don't know us, who don't understand." I stared at her, my mind racing, my chest tight. "This is wrong," I said again, though my voice lacked conviction. "It has to be." "Does it?" she asked, her gaze steady. "Or are you just too afraid to see it any other way?" The silence between us was deafening, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a physical force. I wanted to argue, to push her away, to make her understand why this couldn't happen. But I couldn't find the words. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as she reached for my hand. "I know you're scared," she said softly. "But you don't have to be. Not with me." Her touch was warm, reassuring, and for a moment, I felt my resolve begin to crumble. But then I pulled my hand away, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. "I can't," I said, my voice barely audible. I can't." I turned and walked out of the room, her words echoing in my mind long after the door clicked shut behind me. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about what she'd said, about the way her touch had made me feel. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that walking away was the only choice I had. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The following morning, I woke up feeling more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. My mind had been restless all night, haunted by her words and the way she'd looked at me. I wanted to believe that walking away had been the right choice, but a part of me, one I didn't want to acknowledge, wasn't so sure. Grandma was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Good morning, Jake," she said, her tone light, as though nothing had happened the night before. I nodded in response, avoiding her gaze as I grabbed a cup of coffee. My hands trembled slightly as I poured, and I willed myself to calm down. I couldn't let her see how much this was affecting me. "You didn't eat much yesterday," she said, setting a plate of eggs and toast on the table. "You need to keep your strength up." "Thanks," I muttered, though I wasn't hungry. She sat down across from me, her gaze lingering. "Jake," she said softly, "about last night. Can we not talk about it?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. She flinched, her smile fading slightly. "I just want to make sure you're okay," she said, her tone gentle. I'm fine, I said quickly, though it was a lie. I just need some space, okay? Her expression softened, and she nodded. Okay, she said, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. I finished my coffee in silence, the weight of her gaze pressing down on me. As soon as I was done, I excused myself and left the house, desperate to escape the tension that seemed to follow me everywhere. The day passed slowly, each hour dragging on like an eternity. I wandered aimlessly through town, trying to distract myself, but no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. The way she'd looked at me, the way her touch had lingered just a moment too long, it was all too much. By the time I got home, the sun was setting, casting the house in a warm orange glow. I hesitated at the front door, my chest tightening as I braced myself for whatever was waiting inside. But when I stepped inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. "Grandma?" I called, my voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no response. A knot of worry formed in my stomach as I made my way through the house, checking each room. When I reached her bedroom, the door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open hesitantly. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red-rimmed, as though she'd been crying. "Jake," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." I froze in the doorway, my chest tightening. "Grandma, I don't think—" "Please," she said, cutting me off. "Just hear me out." Her voice was filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, and against my better judgment, I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "What is it?" I asked, my voice guarded. She took a deep breath, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," she said, "and I hate that I've made things so complicated." I opened my mouth to respond, but she held up a hand, stopping me. "Let me finish," she said. "I know what I feel for you isn't normal, and I know it's not fair to you. But I can't help it, Jake. I can't stop how I feel." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stared at her, my mind racing. "Grandma, this isn't— I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly, her voice breaking. I needed you to know, to understand." Her confession left me speechless, and for a moment, all I could do was stand there, the weight of her words pressing down on me. When I finally found my voice, it was barely audible. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. She smiled faintly, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and longing. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I just needed to tell you." The silence that followed was deafening, each second stretching out like an eternity. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. "I think I should go," I said finally, my chest tight. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Okay," she said softly, "but just promise me one thing." "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you won't hate me," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I couldn't bear it if you did." Her words broke something inside me, and I took a hesitant step closer. "I don't hate you," I said, my voice trembling. "I could never hate you." For a moment, we just stood there, the distance between us both unbearable and insurmountable. And then, before I could think better of it, I closed the gap and pulled her into a hug. Her arms wrapped around me tightly, and I felt the warmth of her tears against my shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about what she'd said, about the way she'd looked at me. I knew things couldn't go back to the way they were, but I also knew I wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. The next few days were a delicate balancing act. I avoided her as much as I could, but the house wasn't big enough to escape her completely. Each time we crossed paths, the tension was palpable, an invisible string pulling taut between us, ready to snap. She didn't try to talk to me again, but her presence lingered in every corner of the house. I couldn't shake the memory of her words, her tears, the way she'd looked at me with a mixture of hope and despair. It was all too much. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, I found myself standing outside her door again. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my chest tight with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I told myself I was just checking on her, that I needed to make sure she was okay. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I knocked softly, my breath catching in my throat when I heard her voice. "Come in." She was sitting by the window, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. She looked up when I entered, her expression unreadable. "Jake," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" I wanted to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were folded in her lap. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." I hesitated, my mind racing. I didn't know where to start, how to put everything I was feeling into words. But I knew I couldn't keep running from this, from her. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," I began, my voice trembling. "And I don't know how to feel about it." "About us?" She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand," she said softly. "It's a lot to process." "It is," I admitted, taking a step closer. "But I don't want to lose you. I don't want things to be awkward between us." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained sad. "You could never lose me, Jake," she said. "No matter what." Her words sent a wave of relief and something else, something I couldn't quite name, through me. I crossed the room and sat down beside her, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. "Grandma," I said softly, my chest tightening. "I don't know how to make sense of this, of what's happening between us." She reached for my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to make sense of it," she said. "Sometimes things just are." I looked at her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I wanted to believe her, to accept that this could somehow work, but a part of me still held back, clinging to the belief that this was wrong. "I don't want to hurt you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to move forward." She squeezed my hand gently, her gaze steady. "We'll figure it out together," she said, "one step at a time." Her words were both comforting and terrifying. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, with her hand in mine, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. The following days felt lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from my chest. We didn't talk about that night again, but the unspoken understanding between us seemed to bring a sense of calm. I found myself seeking her out more often, drawn to her presence in a way I couldn't explain. But with that closeness came a new kind of tension, one that simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. One night, as we sat together in the living room, the tension finally reached its breaking point. She was sitting beside me on the couch, her hand resting lightly on my arm as we talked about nothing in particular. The conversation was easy, the kind of casual chatter that had once been so normal for us. But now, it felt charged, every word laced with an undercurrent of something deeper. At one point, she laughed, the sound light and melodic, and I found myself staring at her, unable to look away. "What?" she asked, her smile fading slightly as she noticed my gaze. "Nothing," I said quickly, looking away. I miss this. Us." Her expression softened, and she reached for my hand, her touch sending a shiver through me. "I missed it too," she said softly. For a moment, we sat there in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. And then, before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both hesitant and desperate. She froze for a moment, her breath hitching, and I felt a surge of panic. But then she responded, her hand moving to the back of my neck as she deepened the kiss. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us. Her touch was soft, her lips warm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together. "This changes everything," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," she whispered, "but I don't care." "Do you?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't let her go. Not now. Not ever. The days following that kiss were surreal. It was as though the world around us had shifted, and everything that had once seemed certain now felt fragile and uncertain. We both knew we had crossed a line, one we could never uncross, but neither of us spoke of it. Instead, we tiptoed around the truth, clinging to the fragile understanding we had built. But the silence couldn't last forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a warm orange glow, she came to me. I was sitting on the porch, staring out at the fields, lost in thought, when I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her expression a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. "Hey," I said, my chest tightening. She stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet brushing against the worn wood as she moved closer. "We need to talk," she said, sitting down beside me. I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to speak. I had been dreading this moment, but I knew it was inevitable. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I know this isn't normal. I know it's not something most people would understand." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, and I struggled to find the right response. "Grandma, let me finish," she said gently, cutting me off. "I know what people would say about us. I know they'd call it wrong, but I also know how I feel, and I can't pretend that what we have isn't real." Her confession sent a wave of emotions crashing over me, and I turned to face her, my heart pounding. "It is real," I said, my voice trembling. "But that doesn't mean it's right." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But sometimes the things that feel the most wrong are the ones that matter the most." Her words struck a chord deep within me, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at her, the weight of everything we had been avoiding pressing down on me like a physical force. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we couldn't keep doing this, but the truth was I didn't want to stop. I didn't know how. "We can't keep living like this," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Hiding, pretending, it's not sustainable." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "But what choice do we have? If anyone finds out?" Her words trailed off, and I reached for her hand, my grip firm but gentle. "We'll figure it out," I said. "Together." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope. "Do you mean that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I do," I said, my chest tightening. "But we have to be careful. We can't let anyone suspect anything." Her gaze softened, and she leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me, on us." The moment felt fragile, like a glass that could shatter at any second, but I held on to it, unwilling to let it slip away. As the days turned into weeks, we fell into a delicate rhythm. We were careful, always mindful of the risks, but the connection between us only grew stronger. Every stolen moment, every shared glance, felt like a small act of rebellion against the world. But even as we found comfort in each other, the shadow of what we were doing loomed over us, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, the tension between us finally boiled over. She reached for my hand, her touch sending a shiver through me, and I turned to face her, my chest tight with anticipation. "Jake," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Her words sent a jolt of panic through me, and I tightened my grip on her hand. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, this isn't sustainable," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I can't keep pretending everything is normal when it's not." Her confession left me speechless, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at her, my mind racing. "What are you saying?" I asked finally. "I'm saying we need to make a decision," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Either we end this now, before it destroys us, or we find a way to make it work. But we can't keep living in limbo." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the weight of everything we had been avoiding come crashing down around us. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't know how to make this work." "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But we have to be honest with ourselves and with each other. No more pretending. No more running." Her words were both a challenge and a plea, and I nodded, my chest tightening. Okay, I said. No more pretending. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was also filled with a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally facing the truth, no matter how difficult it was. And as I looked into her eyes, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together.